Hi everyone, Colthany back, Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of this new PJ Harvey album, I Inside the Old Year Dying. This is a brand new LP from one of the underground's true vets and one of the best singers and songwriters the 90s ever had to offer us, that is Miss PJ Harvey. With countless classics under her belt over the years, one could say Harvey has little to prove at this point, and could easily be feeding us a bunch of rapidly released records that essentially rehash the sounds of old triumphs such as Rid of Me and To Bring You My Love. But instead, she is still locked deep into the current sound in this leg of her career, which began to kick off years ago with some of the eeriest releases in her catalog, namely 2007's White Chalk, also the fiery and socially conscious commentary throughout Let England Shake. She also released another album 5 years after that kind of paled in comparison to the previous two, the Hope 6 Demolition Project, which after that, I'm not really surprised that we saw her take a break from commercially releasing music to focus instead more on soundtrack work and poetry, which is kind of how things snowballed into this new project here that sees Harvey taking poems from her recently released Orlam book and setting them to music that often feels very skeletal, repetitive, atmospheric, with a palette of very dark folk rock instrumentation, not too much unlike we heard on England Shake or Hope 6. So a similar itch is very much getting scratched again, but instrumentally and melodically, I guess you could say Harvey is taking a simpler and more mesmerizing approach, which leaves us with moments like Autumn Term, whose bare guitars and drums I think could have used more building outside, of course, the pianos that seep in around the midpoint. Not to mention the vocal harmonies are so cartoonishly ghoulish, they kind of render some of the poetry a little unintelligible anyway, and structurally the whole thing just fizzles out in the end. Even one of my favorite tracks on this thing, A Child's Question, August, which features one of the gravest and most beautiful choruses of Harvey's career. What says Dunnock, Drush or Dove? Love me tender, tender love. The instrumental here really could have used more variation outside of these distant keys and some plodding drums that are barely keeping pace and just feel like they're about to fall asleep. I mean, without a doubt for PJ Harvey, this is a somewhat odd album, but sometimes I feel like her and the band mistake these instrumentals and raw noises for being more experimental than they actually are. Like with Seaman I, for example, which I think is one of the better tunes on this project generally. The doomy descending chords are great. The way the horns layer up at a few parts of the cut, it's sinister. But the track is also covered with these random tremolo sound effects that keep popping up in the background like an annoying alarm or a phone notification that won't stop. I just don't really see how it complements the whole recording. There's also the washed out guitars and rhythmically grinding woody bits of percussion throughout August. Another moment on the album where I guess the music ends because the poem itself just comes to a close, which really goes to show which part of PJ's writing and creative process here is kind of leading the way with these tracks. Sometimes whatever instrumental is in the background just kind of comes across like a second thought. A vibe I also caught off the title track to this thing, which I wish was longer. And it's unfortunate because I do think there are some good musical and sonic ideas on this project. A lot of them just aren't developed all that far. Like with the goosebump-inducing vocals and cultish refrains and twangy beds of blurry guitar on A Child's Question, July, which again are all great, but once we reach a certain point in the song, it just fails to continue building up from there and slowly just peters out like a cloud of dust that at one point I could see, but the breeze just kind of takes it out of the picture. However, it's not my prerogative to totally tear this record apart. There are certainly highlights. The closing track is quite fiery and gratifying, that's for sure. Inside the Old I Dying is also one of the better tunes here, which was also a teaser to the record. Ends with a very chilling and repeated refrain, and I think this track really brings home a lot of the record's themes around aging, entering into a different life phase. Some of what PJ says on this track even goes as far as to liken, moving out of this more youthful stage of her life to that of shedding skin. And look, generally speaking, I do think the lyrics and poetry throughout these tracks is very good. I especially liked what was written into the track Lonesome Tonight, a story of a lost love that's told in very evocative fragments with some surprising Elvis references that come up at least during a few points during the record, and that's one thing about these poems. A lot of them do kind of connect on a deeper level, and also on a macro level as a story. And while these characters such as Elvis, do have references or allusions that, sort of tie into the real world that we live in, the way they operate in the tales that Harvey is pulling together on this record, they come across almost like otherworldly and folkloric. In addition to that, I love the language that Harvey uses on a lot of these cuts too. There's kind of an old world dialect to much of it that really kind of transports me to whatever surreal fever dream everything that's being written about here is happening in. But yeah, overall I did like this record, and I thought it was a pretty decent one for Harvey, even if there were some finer instrumental details or inner workings that I think could have been more interesting, more detailed, or some of the song structures just built out a bit more. Even with those shortcomings, the tunes, the instrumentals, the performances on this thing are quite haunting, quite gripping, even with them being as ghostly and as subtle as they are, and I'm feeling a light to decent 7 on this one. Transition, have you given this record a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video to check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, PJ Harvey of Forever.